The wine reached her before she could move. It came in a wave, dark red against the white of her collar, and the sound it made against her gown was almost nothing, a soft weight landing where no weight was invited. Cecily felt the cold of it through her bodice before she understood what had happened. And by the time she did understand, the ballroom had already resumed its noise around her. The violins did not pause. The candles did not dim. 120 guests continued their orbits, their glasses lifted, their laughter ascending to the gilded ceiling of Trentham House, and Cecily stood at the edge of that bright machine, soaked to the chemise, with nowhere to go that would not require crossing all of it. She did not cry out. She did not even step back. She simply stood, one hand pressed flat against her ruined skirt, and looked at the young footman who had stumbled, whose expression held such genuine horror that she almost spoke to reassure him. It was not his fault. She could see that plainly. The shoulder that had redirected him belonged to Lady Dorothea Vane, who stood 3 feet away in a gown of midnight silk, her attention already redirected to Miss Portia Fenwick at her elbow, as though no disruption had occurred at all. Cecily noted this. She noted it the way she noted most things now, quietly, behind a face she had trained to give nothing away. What she did not note, because she had no reason to turn in that direction, was the man who had gone still at the far end of the room. She would learn later what that stillness meant. But that evening, she knew only the cold weight of the wine and the long, careful walk to the servants' stair. She had not always stood at the edge of rooms. There had been a time, 5 years ago, when Cecily Holt was a gentlewoman's daughter with a small but respectable portion, a father whose debts had not yet consumed the horizon, and a future that included, at minimum, the possibility of a choice. She was 23 years old now. The portion had gone with the house, and the house had gone with the entail. And the entail had expired the year after her mother died, when her father's signature on 3 separate notes had finally rendered all of it paper and shame. £4,000. That was the sum her father's optimism had cost her. She knew the figure the way one knows the length of a room one has paced too many times. £4,000, held by 2 creditors and 1 patient solicitor who had been patient for so long he had begun to treat the debt as a kind of companionship. The money could not be recovered. The entail could not be reversed. What remained to a gentlewoman of no fortune and no family connections, who wished still to eat and sleep under a roof that was not a charity institution, was service. Mrs. Agnes Trentham had hired her 8 months prior, at £32 the year, to read aloud, to manage correspondence, to accompany her employer through the rooms of polite society as a kind of furnished fixture. Mrs. Trentham was neither cruel nor kind. She was indifferent in the specific way of women whose comfort requires no active consideration of others, and Cecily had adapted to that indifference with the same precision she brought to everything else. She arranged herself to be useful and invisible in equal measure. She anticipated requirements. She did not have opinions about wallpaper or about the marriages of young women who had dowries. She did not, if she could help it, look directly at things that reminded her of what she no longer was. The season's first great ball at Trentham House was one such thing, and she had managed its particular cruelties tolerably well until the wine. She had changed her gown in the room off the servants' stair, a plain spare room with 1 candle and a hook on the wall, and she had put on the gray wool that was her second dress, and the only other dress she owned that would pass without comment, and she had returned to Mrs. Trentham's side in less than 20 minutes, her hair repinned, her expression unaltered. Lady Vane noticed her return. The glance she gave Cecily contained an assessment so brief and so complete that it functioned less like a look than like a verdict. "The companion," she said to Miss Fenwick, in a voice calibrated precisely to carry no further than necessary, has recovered with admirable efficiency. One does hope the gown was not borrowed." Miss Fenwick smiled. It was a small, appropriate smile, the kind that confirmed agreement without committing to cruelty. Cecily heard it. She moved 2 steps to the left, positioned herself at Mrs. Trentham's shoulder, and opened the small notebook in which she recorded her employer's social obligations. She wrote nothing. She was not required to write anything. She simply needed something to hold. If she had looked up at that moment, across the ballroom, past the dancers and the chaperones and the young men who were performing their own assessments of the room's available possibilities, she would have seen a man in a dark coat standing very still near the east window. He was not a man who was generally unnoticed. The Duke of Ralston occupied space differently than other men, with a quality of contained attention that drew the eye even when he clearly wished it did not. He was 34 years old, had inherited his title at 29, and had been in mourning, in one way or another, for 3 years. His name appeared in every invitation list in London. His presence in a room altered the room's social temperature. That evening, however, he had not moved from the east window in some time, and the reason for his stillness was something no one else in the room had understood well enough to observe. He had watched the wine incident from the moment the footman stumbled. He had seen Lady Vane's shoulder. He had seen Cecily's hand press flat against her ruined skirt, and the careful, deliberate arrangement of her face, and the long route she chose to the servant's stair that would take her around rather than through the center of the room. He had watched all of it, and something in his chest had tightened in a way that was not polite sympathy. He did not examine that tightening. He turned back to the window instead, and the city beyond it, and the cold glass that gave him something to focus on that made no demands. He would learn later what that tightening meant as well. He did not expect to. The second week of the season brought Trentham House its usual traffic of afternoon callers, musical evenings, and the slow accumulation of social obligation that Mrs. Trentham navigated with the help of her household and her companion. Cecily managed the correspondence, scheduled the drawing-room teas, and carried out the dozen small, invisible tasks that sustained a gentlewoman's social life, without ever appearing to require anyone's acknowledgement. There was a third member of the household who required more than acknowledgement and received less. His name was Thomas, and he was 11 years old, and he was the orphaned nephew of Mrs. Trentham's late husband, left in her guardianship by a will that had clearly not anticipated how little Mrs. Trentham enjoyed the company of children. Thomas could not hear. He had been born with the kind of silence that other people found uncomfortable, and so they had furnished him with tutors and an upstairs room and the general understanding that he was present, but not participating. Cecily had discovered the music room on her third day in the house. She had gone in to close the curtains and found Thomas sitting at the old pianoforte, his hands resting on the keys, pressing nothing, only feeling the wood beneath his fingers with a patience that had no audience and no purpose except itself. She had sat down beside him. She had placed her hand on the pianoforte frame where he might feel the vibration, and she had opened the French grammar that happened to be under her arm, and she had begun to read aloud, not to him precisely, but in the direction of the room. He had looked at her. He had not left. By the third week of the season, she had developed a system. She brought different books on different days. She traced letters on the back of his hand when a word interested him, which he had come to understand as the signal for his own slate and chalk. She learned which passages made him press the keys harder and which made him withdraw entirely, and she adjusted accordingly. It was not a program of instruction. It was not anything she had been asked to do. It was simply the only hour in her day that required her full attention and gave her the relief of being fully present somewhere. She did not know that on an afternoon in the second week of March, the door to the music room had been pushed open by a man who had called at Trentham House on an entirely different matter and been conducted incorrectly by a new footman to the wrong wing of the house. Edmund had not announced himself. He had stopped in the doorway of the music room, one hand on the frame, and watched. Cecily was reading from a travel narrative about mountains in Switzerland, the kind of prose full of altitude and light that she had found caused Thomas to lean slightly forward. She was tracing a word on the back of the boy's hand. Thomas was pressing a single low key on the pianoforte, feeling the vibration that her voice was producing in the instrument's frame. His eyes fixed on the wall above the music stand, with an expression of such concentrated interior attention that he seemed, in that moment, to be somewhere the rest of them could not reach. Edmund stood in the doorway for 1 minute and 40 seconds. He counted. He did not examine why he was counting. He withdrew without speaking. He found the correct room. He conducted his business with Mrs. Trentham regarding a property matter that had nothing to do with companions or music rooms or boys who pressed keys in silence. He left the house in the same controlled manner he entered it, and he did not speak of what he had seen. What he could not undo was the fact that he had seen it. He had a son of his own. Edmund Jr., who was 8 years old, who had not touched the pianoforte at Ralston Park since his mother died 3 years ago. A boy who had, for 3 years, moved through his days with a careful blankness that Edmund recognized because he had cultivated something similar in himself and had never intended to give it to anyone else. He had tried piano masters and kind nurses and a tutor who came highly recommended and left after 4 months. He had tried, in his restrained and disciplined way, to simply be present in the room, sitting beside his son the way one sits beside a fire that will not catch, waiting. The boy had not played. Edmund had concluded, by the time of the Trentham House ball, that it was his own particular quality of coldness that had produced his son's silence, and that the most useful thing he could do was to find the right environment and remove himself from it. He was in the process of arranging that removal. It was, he had told himself, a practical decision. The woman in the music room, reading about Swiss mountains to a deaf boy who was pressing piano keys to feel the sound, had disturbed something in that arrangement that he had not yet had time to address. He returned his shawl to her 3 days later. She had left it in the Trentham House drawing room after a morning call, and he had noticed it on the chair and picked it up without particularly intending to, and arrived at the hall door as she was descending the stair. He held it out. She stopped 3 steps above him and looked at the shawl, and then at him with the expression of a woman who has learned not to register surprise in visible ways. "You left it," he said. She reached for it. He did not release it immediately, not from any deliberate intention, but because he had something further to say and had not yet determined the words, and in that suspended moment she looked directly at him, and he saw, without the layer of careful arrangement she usually deployed, that she was very tired. "Miss Holt," he said, "come inside and sit for a moment. You look as though you have not eaten today." It was not a polite inquiry. It was a short command, delivered without ornamentation, and she received it as she received most commands from men of his station, with a slight withdrawal of the head and a careful neutrality. "Thank you, Your Grace. I am quite well." She took the shawl. She continued down the stair. He watched her cross the hall and disappear into the passage that led to Mrs. Trentham's morning room, and he remained at the foot of the stair for a moment longer than was warranted before returning to his own affairs. She had read the command as cold duty. He had meant it as the only available language he possessed for the thing he could not name. The audience, if anyone had been watching, would have read it correctly. Lady Vane had also been watching, in her way, which was not the watching of a woman with a particular personal grievance, but the watching of a woman whose social architecture required that certain people remain in certain rooms. She had organized the season's first ball with the explicit intention of positioning Miss Portia Fenwick before the Duke of Ralston in the most favorable conditions available, and she had done so with the confidence of a woman who had managed 4 successful matches through identical precision. Portia was 20 years old, had £12,000 settled on her, and possessed a quality of composed loveliness that had been specifically selected for its compatibility with Ralston's taste. Lady Vane knew his taste because she had studied it for 2 seasons. She was not a woman who proceeded without study. The wine had been a small improvisation, not planned precisely, but not regretted either. The companion had been lingering in a position that created visual competition, which was not a position a companion should occupy. The redirection of the footman had been an instinct more than a decision. Lady Vane did not examine instincts that produced useful results. What disturbed her, watching Edmund retrieve a shawl from the Trentham drawing-room and carry it to the stair, was a quality of his attention that she had not accounted for. She had seen that quality before in men of his rank, twice in 40 years of season management, and both times it had been expensive. She filed this observation carefully and began to make adjustments. The adjustments materialized 3 weeks later at Mrs. Trentham's Thursday drawing-room tea, a gathering of 14 women and 3 men for the purposes of conversation, cake, and the quiet circulation of information. Cecily moved through the room with the tea tray, as she had been asked to, because the housemaid had sprained her wrist and the second footman was elsewhere, and Mrs. Trentham found it practical to direct her companion to fill the gap. It was the kind of practical decision that revealed, each time it was made, exactly what Cecily's position in the household actually was. She was placing a cup beside Lady Rutherford's elbow when she heard Lady Vane's voice from across the room, directed at Mrs. Hartley but audible to the half of the room that was not currently speaking. "I confess I am surprised," Lady Vane said, "that Mrs. Trentham has not yet addressed the matter of her pearl brooch. I noticed its absence myself when she wore the gray silk last Tuesday, and I could not help recalling that the last person known to have been in her dressing-room was the companion." The room did what rooms do when a well-aimed remark lands in the right air. It did not go entirely silent. Conversation continued in most corners, but the conversations nearest Lady Vane took on a texture of close attention, a particular quality of listening that arranged itself toward the center. Mrs. Trentham's expression moved through surprise, confusion, and something that might have been social calculation, all within the span of 4 seconds. She looked at Cecily. Cecily met her gaze across the room with the same steady arrangement of her face that she had deployed in the ballroom with wine running down her skirt, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make the situation worse. "The companion," Lady Vane continued, not unkindly, in the tone of a woman raising a concern with reluctance, "came to you from no prior reference, if I recall correctly. Simply a solicitor's letter about a clergyman's daughter in reduced circumstances. One does not suggest anything uncharitable. One simply notes that reduced circumstances can produce pressures that more fortunate women are never required to examine." The brooch had been missing for 9 days. Cecily had not taken it. She had not entered Mrs. Trentham's dressing-room in 9 days because Mrs. Trentham had stopped requesting her presence there after a small disagreement about the arrangement of the writing desk that had produced a week of pointed indifference. She knew this, and she knew the telling of it would sound precisely as it sounded, which was desperate. She kept her face still. "The companion," said Miss Fenwick from the window seat where she had arranged herself to best advantage, has a habit of appearing in rooms where she was not particularly expected. She smiled as she said it, the same small, appropriate smile. One notices these things. The label settled over the room like a second season, complete and organized and requiring no further argument. Mrs. Trentham asked Cecily, the following morning, to present herself with her things by Friday. She said it with genuine discomfort, not with cruelty. She said she could not afford even the appearance of impropriety in her household. She said she was sorry. She said it in the way of a woman who is sorry in the way that costs nothing and changes nothing. Cecily thanked her. She returned to her room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a time that she did not count, looking at the wall, and then she began to pack the things that were hers. There were not many. 2 dresses, including the gray wool, the French grammar, a worn miniature of her mother in a frame she had carried since she was 17, its clasp loose from being handled too often, a letter from the patient solicitor, most recently arrived and not yet answered, which she placed at the bottom of the small bag with the care of someone setting down something heavy. She wrote 3 letters that evening. The first was to the solicitor, informing him of her change in circumstances and requesting information about any alternative companion positions for which she might present herself. The second was to a former schoolfellow in Bath, a long shot, and she knew it, but available. The third was to Mrs. Trentham. 2 pages, carefully constructed, setting out the exact circumstances of her time in the house and the precise absence of any occasion on which she had been in proximity to the brooch. She did not name the Duke of Ralston in it. She did not suggest that he might confirm the quality of her character, or that she had any relationship with him that would warrant such a suggestion. She had £32 and her own accounting of herself, and she would offer the latter and not trade on what she did not have. She sealed that letter and placed it on the desk and left it there, and she was aware, setting it down, that she was refusing something she had not been offered and might never be offered, and that this refusal was the only form of dignity available to her. If she had allowed herself, in that moment, to acknowledge that she had hoped for something, she would have acknowledged it then. She did not allow herself. She pressed the miniature's loose clasp flat and placed it in the bag. She would leave London on Saturday. She did not leave London on Saturday. On Friday evening, she received a note written in a hand she did not recognize, directed to Miss Cecily Holt, and addressed to Trentham House with the economy of someone who knew exactly where to send it. The note contained 4 lines. It told her that Lady Vane's winter assembly was being held that evening at Vane House in Grosvenor Square, that Edmund, the Duke of Ralston, would be in attendance, and that a matter pertaining to the pearl brooch had been resolved and would be presented publicly. It told her nothing else. It was signed by a woman named Hargrove, who turned out, when Cecily arrived at Vane House that evening, in the grey wool with her hair dressed as well as she could manage alone, to be the Duke of Ralston's housekeeper, a small upright woman of 60 who met Cecily at the servants' entrance with the air of someone executing a plan that had been thoroughly considered. "You will want to be visible," Mrs. Hargrove said, and conducted her to the edge of the ballroom floor and left. The assembly was smaller than the season's first ball, perhaps 80 guests, and more calculated in its arrangements. Lady Vane had designed the room to be admired, with winter flowers and white candles and the particular atmosphere of controlled elegance that she produced the way other women produced embroidery, through long practice and specific talent. Miss Fenwick stood at her elbow in a gown of pale gold, her posture perfect, her expression carefully open. Cecily stood at the edge of the room in grey wool and waited, though for precisely what she was waiting she could not have said. Edmund entered with the kind of entrance that the room absorbed rather than acknowledged, because men of his rank had been entering rooms like this for generations, and the room knew how to receive him. He crossed from the door to Lady Vane's greeting in 3 even strides, and accepted her welcome with the brief courtesy of a man fulfilling an obligation. He spoke to several guests. He did not look toward the edge of the room. It was only when he reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a folded paper that the quality of his attention shifted. He turned. He found Cecily across the room with the directness of a man who knew precisely where to find her, and for one long moment the room registered nothing except the unusual fact of his looking. Then he crossed the ballroom floor. He did not do it quickly. He moved through the assembled guests with the same measured containment he brought to everything, but the direction of it was unmistakable, and the room felt the direction before it understood what was happening. Conversations shortened, faces turned. Lady Vane, who had been speaking to a woman in blue silk, went very still, which was something Edmund noted in a single short interior instant that she had understood before he arrived what was about to occur. He stopped before Cecily. He said, in a voice that was not raised, but that carried with the precision of a man who had learned to speak in Parliament and in courtrooms and in the quiet authority of his own great house, "Miss Holt did not take the brooch." 7 words. He did not elaborate. He did not. He held out the paper, which was a receipt from his own solicitor, dated 4 weeks prior, recording the purchase of a pearl brooch as a gift for the governess at Ralston Park, and bearing on its reverse the note in Lady Vane's own hand directing that the brooch be placed, discreetly, in Mrs. Trentham's dressing room on the date in question. He had found it 3 days ago. His solicitor had found it, more precisely, in the course of an inquiry Edmund had set in motion the morning after the drawing-room tea, when he had returned from an unrelated call to Trentham House and been informed by Mrs. Hargrove, who made it her business to know the condition of households she considered adjacent to her employer's interests, that the companion had been dismissed. The paper passed through the room. It went first to Mrs. Trentham, who read it with the expression of a woman watching something she had half expected arrive. It went then to Lord Rutherford, who was the most senior peer present after Edmund himself, and who read it with the careful attention of a man who understood that he was being asked to serve as a procedural authority. He looked at Lady Vane. He did not speak. He did not need to. Lady Vane's composure, which had served her for 40 years of seasons and had been specifically constructed to be unassailable, did not collapse. It receded. It withdrew from her face in the way that the tide withdraws, steadily and with total inevitability, leaving behind the plain surface of what had always been underneath. She was a woman who had done a specific, calculated thing, and had been seen doing it by the room that she had organized to see what she wished them to see, and the machinery had reversed. She said after a long moment, "I cannot account for the note." It was the most she could offer. It was not enough. And the room registered that it was not enough. Miss Fenwick, at her elbow, was looking at Edmund with an expression in which, for one brief clause, recognition had replaced certainty. She had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice. The room was telling her now, quietly and without cruelty, that the room had revised its position. Cecily was looking at the receipt in Lord Rutherford's hand, and she was holding herself with the same still arrangement she had maintained through every other public exposure. But her hand, the one not holding her evening bag, had closed around the clasp of the miniature in her pocket, the loose clasp her thumb knew by memory. Edmund turned to her again. The crowd was present. Every face in the room was attending. He said, quieter now, the second sentence intended for her rather than for the room, "I owe you a proper apology for how long this required." She looked at him. For the first time in weeks, in months, the arrangement of her face had nothing to hold together. She was simply present. standing in gray wool in the ballroom of her accuser's house, looking at a man who had crossed a room in front of 100 witnesses to say, plainly, that she was not what they had said she was. "You could not have known sooner," she said. "I could have looked sooner," he said. "I did not." There was a pause in which the ballroom held its breath. The violins had stopped some moments earlier, she realized, and the absence of music gave the pause the weight of something ceremonial, the kind of silence that a room produces not from awkwardness, but from recognition. "I should like," he said with the careful precision of a man choosing each word as one chooses the right key for a lock, "to speak with you in the morning, if you will permit it, in the presence of Mrs. Trentham, who I believe owes you a different kind of conversation than the one she has most recently had." She said yes. She said it simply, without the careful architecture of suppression. Because the architecture had come down, and she did not have the materials at hand to rebuild it quickly. She said yes, and felt the word land in her own chest like something returning to a room it had left too long ago. Mrs. Trentham witnessed this exchange from across the ballroom, her program card folded tight in her fingers, her expression passing through several stages of calculation before arriving at a form of plain recognition. She had dismissed a woman on the word of a person who turned out to have arranged the evidence. This was not a comfortable position. It was also not irreversible, which was the only useful thing she had to work with. She would have the conversation in the morning. Cecily did not leave London on Saturday. She left it the following spring, on a clear morning in April, in a traveling carriage bearing the Duke of Ralston's crest, with her small bag stowed above, and the worn miniature pressed between two books for the journey. The marriage had been quiet and swift, and witnessed by Mrs. Hargrove and Lord Rutherford, and the same patient solicitor who had, in the settlement papers, seen the £4,000 of her father's debt retired in one plain sentence, a thing Edmund had arranged without ceremony and without discussion, on the grounds that it was simply what was required and required no explanation. She had not been sure, in the first weeks after the assembly, what to do with the fact that someone had arranged things without explaining that he had arranged them. She had been sure, after the morning in the Trentham House drawing-room, when Edmund sat across from her and said, with the same level precision he brought to everything, "I have been trying to find the right environment for my son, and I believe, if you are willing, I may have done so." She had been sure then that the arranging was not the habit of a man who made decisions for others without them. It was the habit of a man who had learned to act from the edges of things, and had not yet learned to walk to the center of them. She understood that habit. She had cultivated it herself. She had asked him about his son first, before any other question. And the way he looked at her when she did that was the moment she was sure about the rest. Ralston Park was in Wiltshire, and it arrived through the carriage window as a long stone building under wide gray skies, the kind of house that had been occupied by serious people for so long that it had absorbed their quality. There were formal gardens and a walled kitchen garden and an avenue of limes that were not yet in leaf. There was a stone step worn smooth at its center by 3 generations of footfall, which she noticed as she crossed it, and which she noted with the same quiet attention she brought to things that contained, in their particular worn quality, the evidence of time and use and belonging. Edmund's son was standing at the top of the entrance stairs with Mrs. Hargrove beside him. He was 8 years old and had his father's quality of stillness, the contained watchful attention of a child who has learned that rooms can change without warning, and that the safest approach is to observe first. He looked at Cecily with this quality of attention, and she looked back at him without the careful architecture, simply present, simply herself. She said, there is a pianoforte?" He said after a pause in which his father went entirely still. "In the drawing room." She said, "Show me." He took her through 2 corridors and a room full of covered furniture to a long drawing room with tall windows and a pianoforte against the south wall, its lid closed, a thin layer of dust on the fallboard that told her everything it needed to tell her. She lifted the lid. She pressed middle C. The note rang out in the cold room, and the boy's hand came up, not quite touching the keys, hovering above them, his fingers finding the air above the notes with the same instinct that Thomas had shown in the Trentham House music room, the body knowing the instrument before the mind gave permission. She placed her hand on the pianoforte frame. She could feel the vibration of the note still fading. She said, "I brought a book about mountains." He pressed C, then G, then very quietly, both together. Edmund had stopped in the doorway of the drawing room, one hand on the frame, in the same position he had occupied in the Trentham House music room 6 weeks prior. He did not count the time he spent there. He did not need to count it. He watched his son's hands on the keys, and the woman sitting beside the instrument with her coat still on and her hat still pinned, one hand resting where the sound lived, and something in his chest that had been arranged for 3 years into a disciplined, practical coldness came undone at the joints and simply lay down. He had been told, when his wife died, by well-meaning men and women of his acquaintance, that time would resolve the specific emptiness of a grief like his. He had not found this to be the case. What he had found, in the Trentham House doorway, and again on the hall stair, and again across a ballroom floor in his accuser's house, was that the resolution of that particular emptiness was not a function of time. It was a function of attention. Someone had to be paying it. He had been paying it, cautiously and from a distance, and without admitting what he was paying, for the better part of 2 months. He was done with caution and distance. He had crossed a ballroom to end them. He was not inclined to go back. Outside the drawing room windows, the Wiltshire sky was doing what it did in April, which was considering whether to be winter still or surrender to the season, and the bare limes in the avenue were very bright with the particular luminance of trees about to break into leaf. Snow had fallen the week before, and had not entirely retreated. There were patches of it on the north side of the stone walls, and in the shadowed corners of the formal garden, white against the old gray stone, and the light that came through the windows was the color of something very much beginning. The boy was playing now. He was playing in the tentative way of a child resuming a conversation that had been interrupted, finding his way back through the notes to something he had left in that room 3 years ago. And Cecily was listening with her hand on the frame, and her hat still pinned, and her eyes on the boy's hands, and the drawing room was full of sound. Edmund came in from the doorway. He did not sit at the instrument, or crowd the space, or require anything of the moment, except to be in it. He stood behind the chair where Cecily sat, and rested one hand on the chair back, and listened to his son play, and she felt the warmth of him behind her, and did not shift away from it, and outside the windows the last of the season's snow was melting from the garden walls into the ground that was already, impossibly, beginning to wake. The miniature was in her coat pocket, its clasp pressed flat. She would find a place for it in this house. There would be room. The boy played on, and the room held it. If this story of Cecily's long road to being seen moved something in you, leave a word in the comments and let others find it there. There are more stories waiting.